So you can have the person look at the digit that he or she is trying to type, and then you can measure the brain signal and extract the frequency of oscillations in the electrical activity, and there you go. That's the brain-computer interface. And that's used a lot in practice. I had a senior project student in my lab who implemented such a system and did it successfully. So that's one. The other two I'll talk about in more detail. One of them is called the P300 potential. This is again a very well-known response of the brain. The P300 potential is one of what are called event-related potentials. So there is an event and the brain generates a response to that event. That's the general idea of an event-related potential that happens in response to some external stimuli, stimulus, auditory or visual stimulus. And P300 is essentially basically what let me describe it this way. So basically there are lots of visual stimuli around us, and usually if these stimuli are just things that we don't care too much about, our basic background activity continues. However, when we are faced with a visual stimulus that's sort of interesting, or that's target, that's something that's different for us, then the brain generates a response. The response takes the form of a positive voltage deflection around 300 milliseconds after we are presented with the stimulus. That's why this is called P300, positive 300 deflection. So if you plot signals of this one, they look like the following. So this is time, this is the voltage amplitude. So the red one is your background brain activity. The person is not presented with anything interesting, he or she is just looking around. But then this blue one is the one in which the person is presented with an interesting and sort of surprising and not very frequent target. So what happens is that roughly around 300 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus, you see this positive deflection. So that's a very consistent pattern. So this is something one might exploit. So how do we exploit it? Well, first of all, this should happen infrequently. So it shouldn't always happen, otherwise we won't generate this response. So you use what's called the oddball paradigm. So basically you show the person sort of these sort of high probability non-target or standard events with these low probability or surprising target events. So basically if you do that, you have a chance of detecting this deflection, positive deflection in the brain signals. The interesting thing is that this is consistently detectable. We are already generating these, so to be able to use a BCI, you as a person don't need to be trained. You just sit in there and you generate this anyway. So it's very convenient in that sense. One problem, well, as in many parts of EEG signal processing, the signals are sort of low, very weak, so this requires sort of averaging over multiple recordings. With just one recording, you may not be able to detect this well, but if you repeat this, let's say 10 times, then maybe you will be able to have this clear pattern of difference. So that's a very well understood brain response. Then the question is, okay, then how do we use this for a brain-computer interface? And it has been used in many ways, and one of the ways in which it has been used is exactly in what I showed you at the start, a P300. This is called a P300 spell. So here's the setup. This was first proposed by Farwell and Donchin in 1988. So you have a matrix of characters, right? The goal is to have the person type a word, a sentence, whatever it is, letter by letter. So you ask the person, so basically what you see here is this matrix, and then columns and rows will flash in random order. Let's say the person is trying to type A. You ask the person to concentrate on A and count the number of times in which the row in which A is, or the column in which A is flashed. So basically when this row flashes, the person says 1, 2, 3, etc. When any of the other rows flash, the person is just sitting there, is not interested. So you see that this is an exploitation of the oddball paradigm. So 1 out of these 6 is the target, and the other 5 are not the target. So what you expect is that in that one row, first row, the person generates this P300 response. In the other 5 rows, the person just generates usual brain activity. So based on this, you can detect, well, of course you are recording the EEG signals, you know when the rows and columns have been shown, and you know the piece of data that corresponds to the time when a certain letter or certain row is displayed. You do the same for the columns. And then the intersection of where you detected P300 in rows and in columns is your target. That's how your system works. That's how the system I showed you at the start really works. Is that okay? Is that clear? So I just want to make sure this is something that people have.
Once you choose the row, for example, the row is clear to me, but then how do you determine which letter?
Right, so basically think about it this way. So first let's think about the problem of detecting the row. So there will be, let's say, 6 pieces of signals, and one of them will be detected as the row. Right, so let's say you detected row 1. And then you do the same for columns. And then let's say your algorithm chose column 3. So that means that if you chose row 1 and column 3, the person is trying to type C. Intersection.
So intersection of the rows and the columns are also flashing, and then...
Right, so rows and columns flash in random order. And then you are keeping track of which row or which column has been flashed, and you look at the data that corresponds to the flash of each row and column and figure out if that row or that column has generated a P300 response or not. Is that okay? So, yeah?
But there's certain intervals of time that you have to do that.
Yeah.
So then wouldn't it be a bit time consuming?
Well, it is time consuming, of course. So basically, well, let me give you an idea. So the system that I showed you at the start, or the current version of it, using a system of that form, we can type something like 20 letters per minute, which is slower than maybe handwriting, but it's better than nothing. So I guess that, of course, and the other thing, of course, is that you might have seen that there. So there's the flashes, and then the system is working in the background at that time. And then when it's confident enough, it displays the result on the screen. So what we do is, and that's the repetitions I talked about. Based on just one recording of the signal, you may not be able to differentiate. So our classifier, our algorithms work in the background. They compute probabilities of each row, probabilities of each column. And then from those, we compute the probabilities of each of these 36 characters. Okay? Then, if let's say there's a clear winner, our algorithm declares the result. However, if the algorithm is unsure, then it basically displays the rows and columns once more, and then gets more data. And whenever it's confident, then it declares the result. So basically, the signals of the person really determines, in part, how fast this will go as well. Other questions? Go ahead.
The thing is that in this kind of setup, one row, I mean for any letter, the row or the column which is related to that letter should be flashed more than one time, so that the algorithm can understand and decide that letter and differentiate that letter in comparison to the others.
So, okay, so the way you flash this is that you have a set of 12 flashes, 6 rows and 6 columns. You do that 12 and in some random order. So that is one flash. That means one flash for each row, one flash for each column. After a set of 12 flashes, you can compute the probabilities of all 36 characters. If your algorithm is confident, you declare the result. Otherwise, you move into the next set of 12 flashes. So the number of flashes for each letter in this paradigm is the same. You can make it different as well based on certain intelligent things, but for now, let's not worry about it. It's basically the same number of flashes for each letter, pretty much. So you don't know which one is the target, so you cannot put more flashes for, but the system doesn't know which letter the person is trying to type, so it just flashes everything equally, and then based on that, computes the probabilities. Is that okay?
Yeah, because randomly they are going to be flashed. There is a possibility that two letters have the same amount of number of repetitions of this flashing.
No. Basically, well, the randomization works in the following way. So if you have the set of 12 flashes, you do randomization within these, and then you move on to the next 12. So, and then when you say, let's say, when you have 36 flashes, equal number of flashes for each.
And if you compute it probabilities are equal, so still it declares it's uncertain about the...
Yeah, it will take more data. In that case, it will take more data until it's served, until there is a data. Other remarks? Okay, so basically that's the paradigm. That's sort of this paradigm that many groups in the world are currently using. And in terms of what we do with the signals, we have the signals that correspond to each row and column. We do some pre-processing, filtering, artifact reduction, which I won't talk about. So to be able to make these decisions, you have to design what's called a classifier. Right? You have to come up with an algorithm from the data that has some rules to make a decision about whether there's a p-value or not. And that requires machine learning. And what you do is, and this machine learning is also person-dependent or subject-dependent. So what you do is, you have a training session with each subject for something like 10 minutes. In that training session, you give the subject a known sort of word to type. So you know the truth, essentially. You know what the person is trying to type, which means you know where the P300 signals should be generated. So that's called labeled data. That's supervised learning. You are sort of teaching the system how the person's brain signals behave. Okay? That's training for our algorithm, not training for the subject. The subject just does what he or she usually does in Python. In this training session, you essentially learn the parameters of a classifier. That's the decision rule that your algorithm will use to make decisions. Once you do this training, then the rest is a test session or daily use, whatever you have learned here, you use that logic to make decisions in real time. So that's the way sort of algorithm development works. Okay, so in our lab we have developed a P300 spelling interface. We can type letters, you can type them using color, etc. You can do other things such as call an ambulance or whatever commands you want to issue. This is just a tool to make decisions. You can also make a hierarchical menu. First you declare one thing, and then based on the result you may move into a next menu, etc. You can have sort of a circular interface, you can have a keyboard type interface, so you can do all of those things. So this is the interface side. So we developed spellers based on P300 signals, and different students have developed different things on this system. The first thing I showed at the start was our initial system, just using the EEG data, using a simple classifier to make decisions, and it works. But now as time went on, we wanted to make other academic contributions, and one of these is what's called using language models. So the idea here is, so whenever I'm typing a letter, at this point, I'm just using the EEG data that I have collected that corresponds to that letter or that row, etc. However, if I know that the person is typing in a particular language, Turkish or English, you know the structure of the language, you should exploit it, as is done in speech recognition, as your phone does when you're trying to type a word, etc. So we have developed a system which exploits this in real time. So what we do is we learn the probabilities of letters following other letters for English or for Turkish, and then we use that learned information in our system in real time. So when I'm trying to type a certain letter, I don't just look at the EEG data that corresponds to that letter, but I also look at what my previous decision was. Okay? And that helps me make a declaration more accurately or faster. And that's a video of our sort of more recent language model-based interface. So in this case, the person is typing kulak, K-U-L-A-K. And then moving on to the next letter, I think that's show. So in terms of the video, it will be very similar to what you have seen before, but the algorithm that runs in the background is different. And when we analyze this, you can show that this is faster for the same level of accuracy. You'll see that in the second letter, this will be quite fast, I think. And so that's partially because you're also exploiting information from the past, essentially. Oh, I don't have too much time. So okay, so that's the, well, I have to skip details. So that's typing with a language model, and then we analyze these ideas. I won't get into that. The other thing we do is, that you can do it at the letter level. You can also do this at the word level. That is, let's say you have an application in which you know that the subject is trying to type using a vocabulary of something like 5,000 words, which is something that's plausible for patients. Then you can exploit that information as well. If you know the words that the person is trying to type from, then maybe from the first 3 letters you also already can figure out what the person is trying to type. So let me skip that as well. Let me show this to you quickly, if I might. So this is the reason I'm showing it. Okay, let me first. This is from an undergraduate project. This is just to make the point that undergraduates can also do research in this area quite successfully. Up to this point, I showed you this P300 interface using a matrix environment. There are other ways in which you can use P300 signals, and this is one example. In this case, what you are doing is that you are showing the person some images sequentially. The person is interested in one of those as the target, and picking that and then generating a response. So let me show you this quickly. You'll see some voice in Turkish in the background, but I'll tell you what this is. So you'll see some pictures shown, and the person will focus on, declare that he is focusing on one of the images. All right, let's go slow. So you'll see some images, and the person is now, in the first one I think, is trying to choose quality. So the system is now working, and then when it's confident, it will show. Now it's finding the result, and that's the result. So that's how this works. This is an undergraduate project. So it looks like I'll run over my time, so I'll try to make the rest faster. So up to this point, I talked about P300 as one technique to one type of brain signal for communication. There are other signals. Another signal that can be used very easily are what are called motor signals. So these are things like when I'm in the process of moving my right arm, as I plan, start, and execute this motion, there are changes in the signals, electrical signals in my brain, especially in the motor cortex. When I'm doing a right-hand movement, there are certain frequency changes in the left side of the motor cortex. So that's another thing that can be exploited well. So you can look at signals at different frequency bands, and this will give you one picture of that. The signal at this frequency band, which is called alpha band, as you show the subject a cue to execute some kind of motion, what happens is that the power of this signal decreases just after that cue is shown. That's a pretty characteristic pattern generated by it. More interestingly, this signal is generated even if I don't actually do the motion, but I just imagine doing the motion, which is of course quite interesting and useful because we want to use these types of interfaces for people who actually cannot do the real motion. So you can come up with brain-computer interfaces using things like that. You can ask the subject to execute sort of right arm motor imagery or left arm motor imagery, and then you can have a ball sort of move on the screen with respect to the result, etc. So we have some work that created contributions in this area. Let me skip that. Let me also mention this. So up to this point, it was all EEG. We have also done some work in which we have used electrocorticography, which is signals that are recorded from the cortex of the brain. And from such signals, as I said before, you can do things like determine which finger this person is moving or imagining to move, etc. From the surface, you cannot do this at this level of resolution. The last thing I'll sort of talk about quickly is that up to this point, I talked about communication, use of BCIs for communication. Now, in this piece of work, for the last 3 years or so, we have been thinking of and trying to use brain-computer interfaces in rehabilitation, robotic rehabilitation of stroke patients. So the background here is that when a person suffers stroke, immediately after stroke, the person should start physical therapy. Conventionally, this is done by help by a physical therapist. Over the last 20 years or so, people have developed these rehabilitation robots. So the robot helps the patient do certain types of movement. The idea is, in this process, the person sort of through plasticity of the brain, recovers the ability to make connections again. And there is a very good group here at Sabancı University in mechatronics, human machine interfaces group of Volkan Patoğlu, who actually developed these types of rehabilitation robots. So for the last few years, we have been asking this question of, well, can we use brain signals somehow in this process? So you might ask, well, why, or how is that useful? And this is, of course, a risky research with sort of unclear outcomes at some level, but we got interesting results. So the idea is the following. Their belief is that in a rehabilitation protocol, if you get the patient more involved in the task, the rehabilitation is usually better. And in conventional, they try to measure the level of involvement of the patient by measuring forces applied by the patient, etc., using various types of force sensors. However, think of a subject who suffered from a very terrible stroke. There is no residual motion. So you cannot measure anything about the level of involvement or intentional participation of the person. So in that case, the only hope you might have is to measure the brain signals, somehow use the intention to move in this rehabilitation process. Maybe change something about the velocity of a robot, etc., based on the results. And that was sort of an idea, and then we realized this idea and come up with some experiments. So in this case, you have this robot, and we change the velocity of the robot based on motor imagery signals collected from the patient. So the video of this would look like this. So here, what you don't see, of course, here, but the velocity of the robot is determined by how strongly the person is actually imagining to move his right arm in this case. Now, of course, you can do this. It's interesting from an engineering standpoint, but then the question is, well, is this interesting then, or is this useful for rehabilitation? So we have done some experiments to try to answer these types of questions. And so what time should I shut up? 10 more minutes, or?
Yeah.
Okay, well, last 10 minutes. Right. There are a couple of questions you can ask here. One is, so rather than using a brain-computer interface, just showing the subject things on the screen, there is now actual motion. Does that help you get better performance with brain-computer interfaces? This was one question. Our partial result says yes. I'll skip the second one. But the core question here is, does using brain signals in that process, in the long term, will that be useful rehabilitation? Will it make it faster? Will it make it better, etc.? We don't have a clear answer to that yet, but you can try to sneak up on that answer by measuring certain things, and one of them is mentioned in this question here. So the question is, so here you can have a subject go through this exercise, and the robot moves the arm, and then you can measure the brain signals, and you can determine how strongly the person is generating these motor imagery signals. So presumably, if the subject is more involved in the task, then you will see these signals more strongly. Otherwise, they won't be that strong. So we come up with experiments in which, with subjects, we generate different types of rehabilitation protocols. And this first one is the protocol we propose, which is that in this process of the robot moving, you determine the velocity of the robot through brain signals, as opposed to this protocol here tells the patient that just sit there, the robot will move you, you don't have to do anything. What we do then is, in these two protocols, we look at the signals the subjects generate as a function of time, and then especially in this frequency. We try to measure if this kind of phenomenon of suppression of signals at certain frequency bands is stronger in this protocol. And indeed, what you see is here, as you go from this point onward, after you ask the subject to move, there is a very strong suppression in this protocol in which you ask the subject to modify the velocity of the robot through thought, whereas in this protocol, that suppression is not that strong. So that's partial proof that when you have the subject, get the subject involved in the task through the brain signals, perhaps you are actually getting the subject more involved, getting the sort of motor cortex work more, essentially. So that's one piece of hope. Let me try to summarize. So this is current work. There is ongoing work in my group. This is actually the result, partial result from Ismail's, what will be his master's thesis. So basically, up to this point, all of the things I talked to you about involved sort of a training session, and then a testing session. But what if you don't have the luxury of having a long training session? Can you learn from when you are actually using the system, can you learn from that behavior somehow to improve your classifier? The challenge, of course, is that in actual use, you don't know the truth. You don't know what letter the subject is trying to type. You don't know if he or she is imagining to move right arm or left arm, so it's a tricky problem. The other thing in which this is very important is that you start your system with a training at the start, and then you use it for hours, and then things change. The signals change, so things are non-stationary. So how do you adapt? As time goes on, your signals change. How do you take that into account? So that's the theme of Ismail's master's thesis. And then another one, Ozan's master's thesis here, and this is using what's called neurofeedback. So in my sort of robotic rehabilitation work, I mentioned this idea of sort of having stronger motor imagery. But this work is taking a more deeper look into that question. So you can ask the question, when a subject suffers stroke, what type of brain activities are suppressed or what type of brain activities are damaged? So you can first measure that. And then you can come up with games in which you reward the subject for increasing that type of activity which has been lost. So you can come up with a game in which that activity is modulated. And then you can monitor how well that is getting well. So hopefully at the end of this, maybe you will help the person recover that type of brain activity that has been lost, and hopefully that will be related to better motor recovery of the patient. Okay, so there are other things that my group are not doing currently, but these are some trends that you should know. One is use of BCI in gaming. This is an interesting research area, but of course in things like this, there's also lots of fiction rather than science as well, so be careful. In some cases, people do these kinds of things. What they are recording are not really brain signals, but they pretend they are. So, but there's serious work as well. It's a very interesting area. Another one that's kind of trendy is sort of wireless BCI systems that are fashionable and all of these things, which is also another interesting direction. This is important for practical use of these types of systems. So, okay, so since this is the future seminar series, let me start with sort of an eye toward the future. So these are a couple of directions in which I think there will be important developments in the future on BCI and sensors. Developing what are called dry electrodes, rather than electrodes in which we use gel or wireless systems is important. Exploitation of other brain patterns, other than the ones that I have talked about here, could be interesting. Other things like P3 and motor imagery. The interfaces I talked about today are nice, but still they are not that easy to use for a long time. That speller, you don't want to live with that flashing letters, what are other options? So that's another kind of code. So our work usually lies in here, signal processing and machine learning algorithms. So I think that this is a research area that's still pretty sort of in its early stage of development. That's my statement. I think BCI is very areas like speech processing were 30 years ago. So there are interesting research directions here, which I will go to, and there are lots of different applications. So maybe I'll stop, and I don't know if there's time to take questions. I'm happy to take questions. Go ahead.
There are multiple channels through which we are collecting data
Yes,
with
good.
regards to electrical activity
Yep.
of brain. I was wondering how you combine all these channels
Right.
in order to
So
understand.
there are a couple of questions here. One is, well, which channels do you collect data from? And that depends on what you are trying to do. So in experiments in which we do motor imagery, we pretty much know that the strongest signals are from the motor cortex, which is sort of the two electrodes here called C3 and C5. And pretty much you should collect those and maybe things around them. Whereas in other applications, in Ozan's work, we are interested in collecting data from something like 64 channels. In a spelling experiment, maybe we collect data from 10 to 12 channels. When we collect data, it's basically we have a long vector of features. We basically concatenate them together. And then we learn in this high-dimensional space after feature extraction. So that's how. Others? Okay, well, I'm happy to talk to those of you afterwards.